All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Marina. I'll do a little brief intro, and I'll let her introduce her panelists. But this is what I affectionately refer to as our annual scariest panel ever. Everything that you didn't know that you needed to be afraid of, you're going to hear about today. So, Marina Pavlovic is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law, Common Law section at the University of Ottawa, and is a member of its Center for Law, Technology, and Society. Her expertise is in consumer rights, in the cross-border digital society, and in technology, policy, and regulation. And she has an incredible panel that I will let her introduce. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you, Lynn. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Okay, good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and recognize that we're in traditional and unceded Algonquin territory. The broad theme of this panel is privacy and safety, and even though it may be dubbed as the scariest panel ever, I would also like it to be a little bit more of a most constructive panel ever. So where do we move from scares to actually, doing things the right way? And we're going to talk broadly about the issues that arise, awareness, and ways forward regarding privacy and security. And with the particular proliferation of IoT devices, there are a number of indirect and direct implications on individuals as consumers, to governments, businesses, and society at large. And the panelists to take us through this ever-changing topic are, on my right, Mark Buell, North American Bureau Chief of Internet Society. Suzie Dunn, lawyer and currently a PhD student at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law and member also of the Center for Law, Technology and Society. Bonnie Butlin, who's co-founder and executive director of Security Partners Forum, an expert network member on cybersecurity at World Economic Forum. She's been dubbed the First Lady and the Queen of Security, and I'm gonna say she's the Empress of Security. We're putting the titles up. And then last, but definitely not least, Paul Sammut, who's the Cybersecurity Senior Manager at KPMG. So Mark, I'd like to start with you, and we've heard a little bit about the Internet Society's multi-stakeholder work on security of IoT, so if you could talk a little bit more about that, the output, and then what are the next steps now that we have these policies, where do we move from here?
Thanks, Marina. Just to address Lynn's comment, we may be the scariest panel, but we're the panel with the solution. And full on plug for the work we did over the past year through a process called the Canadian Multi-Stakeholder process to enhance IoT security, which we did in partnership with Innovation Science and Economic Development, CIRA, CIPIC, and Canary. So over the span of a year, we worked with our partners and a multi-stakeholder community from across Canada to develop a set of recommendations to secure the Internet of Things in Canada. We heard Andrew talk about it this morning. But take a step back and talk about security in general and why a multi-stakeholder approach was the ideal approach to look at securing IoT in Canada. The Internet it's a complex system, and I don't mean on the technical side, it's a complex system. I mean, from users to applications to regulations to norms to protocols. We've created this system that's incredibly complex, and it's very difficult for a government to figure out how to secure that or to work with that. So we proposed a multi-stakeholder process where all of the organizations that benefit from the success of IoT would come to the table to talk about how to secure IoT. Today we launched that report with a set of recommendations for across the gamut of stakeholders, from end users to device manufacturers to internet service providers to organizations like MediaSmarts, who do absolutely incredible work in the digital literacy realm. I encourage everyone in the room to look at the report. If you see something that interests you, we have a call for support to implement the recommendations in the report.
Suzie, okay, the mic thing is really, I'm bad at multitasking. I'd like to sort of probe a little bit more, and if you could talk about some of the risks that IoT devices and generally connectivity pose, particularly for marginalized communities, and then we're going to take it from there.
Thanks. Often when we think about the Internet of Things, we're often thinking about security breaches and the way that our private data can be misused by the companies that create them. But often we forget to think about the way that this technology can actually be used against marginalized communities or people who have specific vulnerabilities. When we think about bringing in IoT devices into marginalized communities such as Black communities or Indigenous communities that have been historically over-surveilled, there's different risks that are involved that we need to be thinking about. And often, a lot of the people that are creating these devices often aren't from those communities and aren't thinking of the risks that are inherent in them. And beyond the misuse of IoTs by companies or by hackers, one of the main misuses that we're seeing is the use of IoTs as a tool to perpetrate gender-based violence. And some research that's being done out of the University College of London by a woman named Leonie Tancher. And Leonie Tancher has a research project that's called Gender and the Internet of Things. And she looks at the way that abusive intimate partners are using IoTs to perpetrate violence. And we've seen two major trends in it. And so the first way that it's being used is that when someone's in a relationship with an abusive partner, they're having their partner use Internet of Things devices in order to monitor and control their behavior. So they'll use something that typically is used as an exercise device that monitors where you're located, where you're moving, and then the abusive partner will have access to the app so they can see where their partner is and constantly monitor where their partner is. And so you have a device that's being used in the way that the company intended it to. You turn it on, it collects GPS, they're not breaching any of the privacy expectations in it, but is then being used in a way to monitor and control people. We've also seen smart home devices used in the same way. So you have security devices that are meant to monitor who's coming in and out of your house, often to see if delivery people are coming or to be able to look inside your home when you're on vacation. And then these smart technologies are actually being used by abusive partners to ensure that their partners are at home at all times. And this creates a very isolating space. And there's also audio with that, so they can eavesdrop on their conversations, they can see what's going on at all times. And so there's major privacy and security violations that are happening within that intimate relationship. The second thing we're seeing for abusive IoTs is outside of relationships. And looking at the gender norms, classically what we see is in heterosexual relationships, the male partner is often the person who installs the technology and understands the technology. So they know the passwords, they're the ones with the apps, they have access to all these devices. And then once the relationship breaks down, that partner can still have access to these internet-connected devices without their partner being made aware of it. So two cases that we've seen. One was a case in the US, and it was a woman who had bought a home and she installed a 100,000-pound security system device in her home in the UK with her partner. And so they were able to control their temperature, control their music, they were able to unlock and lock their doors, and it also had audio capabilities. And she separated from her partner, and her partner moved out of the house, and he was able to know where she was and knew all of these details of what was happening in her life and was able to use that against her during custody battles and during their legal separation battles. And she couldn't figure out what was happening until she was at home one day and she was having a conversation with her mother where she was talking about how she no longer loved her partner, and then he ended up storming into the house an hour or so later in a rage, and she was able to see that she had been monitored the whole time. Another really problematic way we're seeing Internet of Things devices used is partners will use them to turn on loud music at night. So there's a case in the States where a woman, again, spent $100,000 to install this amazing system into her home, but the home was owned by her partner, and the security system was actually owned by her partner. And in the middle of the night, he would play really loud heavy metal music. Or she'd come home and the temperature would be turned down really low or would be turned down very high. Or he would have the lights flickering on and off. And so she was essentially being tormented in her own home. And when it comes to a legal standpoint, there's been real challenges when it comes to no contact orders and restraining orders to include the Internet of Things in it. Because often these classic legal orders that we have say you can't come physically close to a person, or you can't phone them, you can't contact them, you can't email them. But when someone's turning the heat on in your house to cause you stress, how do you include that in different legal orders? And so that's just one of the important ways that we need to be thinking about these devices beyond just privacy breaches by companies. Thanks so much.
That was scary stuff. Okay, so we are the scariest panel for now. So, Bonnie, if you could tell us from the work that you've been doing some of the new challenges that are emerging in addition to what Suzie was talking about, perhaps a little bit more on technical level, and if you have some suggestions on what Suzie was talking about, like how do we manage these devices not to be really abused beyond just pure cybersecurity issues when we're talking about, you know, people penetrating networks in our own homes.
Right. Can you hear me? My background is more from a non-technical approach. So I look at the geostrategic aspects of cybersecurity with the background in international affairs, military doctrine, strategy. And so there are some similarities to what you're saying at a domestic level. What I'm seeing are challenges within the international law regimes, particularly in terms of 5G and international investment, foreign investment in the telecom sectors, that it again has some very serious gaps and divergences, not only within the different international law regimes, and there is no cyber security law at all. We have the Tell-In manual, we have Microsoft, who in 2014 tried to come up with some kind of norms, but there is no international cyber law, and so we have to rely on international trade law, international investment law, the humanitarian law regime, and this is where we're seeing what I suspect is that 5G and the case of Huawei are in fact more symptomatic of problems that we're going to run into in the future, either with China or other countries, and with Russia, and even potentially India, as other countries start to move in not only different interpretations of international law in terms of cybersecurity and access into global markets, but also different interpretations completely. The Russian interpretations of international law are from a very different doctrine altogether. For example, President Putin actually has a degree and wrote a thesis on international law and focused on most favored nation status. So the Russian approach very much is integrated with international law. By legally, they actually recently included international law into their foreign affairs approach, which has then fed into, I would argue, their military strategies, which have changed radically recently. All of that is affecting Canada. For example, with the Huawei CFO case, you can see there's a criminal law aspect, there's a foreign investment law factor, there's an international trade law factor with it, and no easy solution, but Canada's right in the middle.
I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but I'm going to reserve them for now. So Paul, would you tell us a little bit about, so obviously there are different players and everybody has to mind their own interests and interests of others. So how do businesses protect themselves from some of these vulnerabilities and ensure that, you know, they have solid business models working in this environment where there are so many challenges?
Yep, sure. So, I mean, just to take a step back, really, in terms of the kind of size and scale of the problem. So, if you think back 20 years ago, 1999, and everyone was worrying about the Millennium Bug. And if you think about devices, for example, in your home, you may have had a desktop computer, you may have had a laptop, but you probably didn't have a mobile phone that was connected to the internet. Whereas in Canada in 2018, there's 114 million IoT devices, and that's in the home and in businesses. And I read a report from Ericsson, which came out yesterday, saying that in 2024, they estimate there'll be 22 billion IoT devices globally. And it just shows the staggering pace of change that there is and the scale of the potential problem, because all of those devices potentially offer an attack vector for whether it's a criminal gang, a cyber criminal, a hacker, to actually gain access to the network or to your personal information or your data. So there's also a great example that kind of shows how left field it can become as well. So a casino in North America had their network compromised, and it came from a thermostat that was attached to an aquarium in the lobby, and this was internet connected. So hackers were able to gain access to the network. They were able to extract the high roller database and take 10 gigabytes worth of data out of the network, and it was traced back to a server in Finland. So you can imagine the kind of IT department in the casino that, they're thinking about their computer systems, the mobile devices that their employees have. But then to think about the thermostat of a fish tank or an aquarium in your lobby, it just puts into perspective the wider problem and the wider issue. So in terms of what organizations can do, it's really about understanding what is on their network and what is attached to the internet, and thinking about the potential attack vectors that could come in onto those devices, and thinking more broadly across their whole ecosystem.
So I'm going to give you an opportunity to react perhaps to something you've heard on the panel before I start asking questions. So Mark?
Just to build off what you were saying, one of the things I think needs to happen in the future is, we have a lot of devices that are coming online that we never thought we would need internet access. They're not, we call them smart devices, but very often they're actually not very smart. Your light bulb isn't smart enough to have built-in security. And the companies making these devices, like your internet-connected coffee maker, it's a coffee maker company who buy a cheap chip out of China, put it in to connect your coffee maker to the internet. They're not thinking security up front when they manufacture that device. And we need to have a bit of a mind shift of device manufacturers to think security from day one. In the internet world, we tend to think of security, well, now we do, early on, but a coffee pot maker, not necessarily. So that is a fundamental shift I think we'll have to make in the next few years.
Bonnie?
And I agree. I think this is one of the fundamental problems we're going to have now, is that the supply chains and the production of products has been internationalized, but there isn't an agreement or an agreed approach in how to approach it, or even how to approach security with it, whether it's within products all the way on up to more political aspects of how we're going to deal with technology on an international level. And particularly, again, with 5G, which is pushing us into an international surface. So right now, for example, the UK is rolling out, last I heard, about 18 5G projects in 2019 already. Canada's just starting to come online with the 5G proposals and projects. But other countries are well ahead, and how that's all going to sustain. How do you hive off part of that, as the US now, particularly with the executive order of May 15th, And then, for example, with Huawei being listed as an entity on the 16th, the following day, and not just in the US, but also in Canada and a whole range of other countries as well, this is becoming very, very challenging for how we are going to deal with products, or whether it's chips or any other kind of component, when, for example, a company has now been put on the entity list in the US. And that's going to be very challenging for a country like Canada that is expansive geographically and requires cheap components, for example.
Suzie?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think it's, we need to have businesses thinking about the way IoT can be used, and also consumers. And so when it comes to businesses, it's so important that we have people who are thinking about the ethics and the problems that can come up with something like a coffee maker or a thermostat, or a doll. One of my favorite Internet of Things examples was this doll in Germany. It was called My Friend Kayla, and it was this little internet-connected doll, and you'd give it to your child, and the child would talk to the doll, and it would learn about this child, and they would converse together. But then what researchers found was that as long as you had a Bluetooth-enabled device within about 40 feet of this doll, you could eavesdrop on the doll. And so here you have this plaything, which at first was just this cute thing, and then you think of all of the risks with it. So parents were using it, if they were separated, to eavesdrop on the other parent's home. There was potential for child luring, and then there was also potential just for anyone to spy in the household of wherever this doll was connected. And it didn't have very high security to it because it was just a child's toy. But actually in Germany, which has much stricter rules around what type of surveillance devices can be legalized in that country, once they researched this doll, they actually determined that it could potentially be a piece of espionage, and they made this Kayla doll, this little cute doll that was meant to be a toy, illegal, and they put out a press release encouraging all parents to destroy the doll immediately because it was this incredible risk. But I'm sure when the people who were developing these toys, or the people who were purchasing these toys, only thought of it from the perspective of the relationship between the child and the doll, and maybe hadn't thought of these additional risks that came along with it. So during the development and during the purchase of these toys, I think it's important to have people who are thinking about the potential technological security risks, but also the security risks that come personally when you have internet-connected devices in the household. Paul?
Yeah, I think it's a great point in terms of the onus is almost on the consumer at the moment in terms of and it's almost a change in the way you think about when you're going to buy a device. So you might look at a coffee machine and think, oh, it makes great coffee, it looks good, but then you could be thinking, well, is it going to still have security updates in 5 years' time? Can I get that kind of support going forward? And it's almost a change in the kind of mentality of how you can purchase and make those purchasing decisions in the future. So I think that's why we do need that kind of regulation, as we've seen in California. There's been some initial legislation around IoT devices, and even then, it's things like a device must have reasonable security. So how do you actually define reasonable security? And that could definitely change over time as well.
One of the recommendations coming out of our Enhancing IoT Security project was for, in fact, we had a specific working group who looked at a trust mark label for IoT devices, something simple, easy for a consumer to read and see, is this device going to be secure on my network, with something like a QR code on it where they could scan it for more information, or to learn more about how to secure the project. And a lot of the secure IoT devices, some of the steps you can take are so simple, right? Don't ship a device with a default password. If you get an IoT device, change the password right away when you get home as the first thing. A lot of the steps we can take to secure it are actually simple, up to things like having a trust mark label on devices that are sold in Canada.
So I'm going to rattle the cage a little bit and go back to some of the work that I've been doing with Mary Kavanagh, who is back in the room, in terms of consumers' ability to actually absorb information and react on it, because there is such a information smog or data smog that we live in, and for every little thing and every little device in our lives, we have to make so many decisions. So I think while it's important to have trust marks and give people information, it is not the way out of this, because it just imposes such a huge burden on people to make these choices literally on an hourly basis in terms of what we're buying and how do we really exert change. So I was going to push you a little bit to talk about how do we really affect change in this complex environment that has so many actors, both at the national and international level. And Bonnie, if we can start with you in terms of the geopolitical environment currently, and so many things going on, where do we start? Who do we bring at the table? And then I think we'll just go around and see what other ideas may come. Like, where do we move from here? Because we've all been complaining, but things haven't really been changing. They're kind of becoming worse. So where do we go from here?
So we've been moving apart. If you look at the Canadian approach to trade, which in my mind has not really been clearly articulated to Canadians. You'll hear recently that Canada is the only G7 country with a trade relationship with all other G7 countries. And that's true. But it's true because Canada is shifting towards, instead of bilateral trade agreements, to multilateral trade agreements like CETA, like the TPP, and of course the USMCA, but also trying to approach into South America with Mercosur, for example. This is getting very tricky for Canada, and Canada's taken what looks like an approach to try to open trade channels with everyone and limit arbitration from disputes by going to a multilateral agreement structure. The problem is, in my mind, is particularly in terms of security and cybersecurity, is that Russia is moving away from this model and not signing on to the multilateral agreements. China, with our canola dispute right now, is not signed on to the World Trade Organization and is not signed on to TPP and is not going to, I believe. They're moving into a different domestic focus structure, as is the US. Right now, Canada doesn't even have a dispute mechanism. And if you look at Europe, we're looking at higher regulation. GDPR, for example, the Network and Information Security Directive. Huge penalties, 20 million euros, 4% of your revenues for the year, or 17 million pounds for the NIS directive, which is problematic in itself. Yes, it changes behavior. Yes, it makes companies more aware of security and their obligations in the longer run, but you're also blocking out new competitors and new innovation. In the US, I just got back from New York not too long ago, and there were 35 insurance companies for cybersecurity. That's it. And you have to be very careful what policy you get. And there's 50 statutes in place right now for mandatory reporting for information and data loss breach reporting. This is a huge burden for companies trying to operate, even the large multinational companies. And so China, for example, has cut it off. We're not having these arbitration disputes. We're limiting it to a certain bandwidth of complaints that can be raised. And India, for example, I think is a fascinating case. You now have to, in their newer trade agreements, and they're not part of TPP either, even though there's a lot of movement into the region as well in terms of trade, but they're focusing on a domestic solution approach. This is not consistent with how North America and Canada in particular are looking at security, and it's not consistent with how Canada is looking at trade. And so while we can educate Canadians and try to educate them on security or internet use or the Internet of Things and how we operate in the world, we're spreading ourselves in different directions and it's not coming together. And the international law regimes are not helping. The regulation is perhaps complicating more than assisting as well. So we're in a sticky problem.
So who wants to go next? Mark?
Andrew has often reminds us at the Internet Society that you can't internet alone. It takes more than one to internet. You also can't secure the internet alone, and it takes global collaboration to secure the internet. You're absolutely right. In Canada, through the multi-stakeholder process, we brought in academic security experts, CIRA, user organizations, privacy organizations to talk about security, and we collaborated and we came out with what is a strong product. One of the outcomes of that process that we didn't see coming was international collaboration. So last summer, the government of Senegal, through hearing about our process through the Iot chapter in Senegal, sent a delegation to Ottawa to meet with us and find out what we did and how we did it. They replicated that process beginning late last year. France has now done the same, and we have interest from a few other countries for doing a similar process and collaborating. Katie on the last panel had mentioned the Iot Policy Platform. That is a group of national governments who've come together because they all have an interest in securing the Internet of Things. So we have what I would say is a spark of that international collaboration. It's going to take time and it's going to need to grow, but it is happening to some degree.
Yeah, I was just going to say in terms of the, it will take time. And coming from the UK, I had quite a bit of experience of GDPR, the European Data Protection Regulation. And, that was many years in the making, and then companies spent at least a couple of years getting ready for it. And that's certainly raised the bar in data protection globally and data safety. But I think the challenge for, in terms of, when I mentioned earlier, there's going to be 220 billion IoT devices out there in 4 years' time or 5 years' time, then when the legislation or any regulation comes in or any kite mark, that all those devices are already out there, and they're all potentially vulnerable. So it just shows the kind of scale and size of the problem.
Suzie?
No, and I think when you're thinking more on the individual level or the community-based level, I think the place that we really need to go to is making sure that the natural place where people go to get education can also get education about internet-connected devices. So when I think about gender-based violence, right now there is this incredible pressure on shelters and victim service workers to understand this complex technology. And it is an enormous burden to put on a group of people who are already underfunded and overworked. And I've been trying to think of, what a solution to this could be. And ultimately, I think what we need to create some sort of body in Canada, whether that be a governmental body or a nonprofit body, that specializes in understanding the risks that marginalized communities and that women and children face when dealing with these types of technologies, so that people like pediatricians and social workers and teachers can then access that body, who can distill the information down into something that's digestible for the average everyday person, and they can help them make safety plans and they can help them make safety strategies. But I do think that we need to have a place where experts are committed to giving that information to community leaders who can then pass it down, because otherwise that burden on individuals for every single piece of technology that we're using, especially if there's going to be billions of it in our homes and in our schools and in our workplaces, we can't expect individuals to take that on themselves, and somehow we have to lift that burden by providing them with some sort of clear expert response in plain language.
I know you're burning to say something, and Bonnie is too, but I'm going to say something which I might be hated for, or I don't know, not. So I'm going to issue a challenge to Internet Society North America and Canada chapter and Media Smarts and some of the other people in this room to replicate the process that you've done for IoT devices and do something along the lines that Suzie has been talking about. And next year when we're here, back on the third Digital Access Day, we can actually report on some of the outcomes. Because we often talk that things need to be done, but we rarely follow. So I would like to issue a challenge that we actually walk the walk this time and find a way to actually get it done.
So my brain was spinning before the panel started we had already said, we need to talk, we need to plan. I will say one thing in response to some of the discussion that's been going on. I'm not sure we can rely on the mechanisms that we've always relied on in the past to secure something as big and new and complex and as we have with the explosion of IoT. I think we need to look at much more innovative approaches. I would throw out the interesting work Sierra is doing. They're doing some very innovative work on something called a secure home gateway, so that when you have these not so smart devices, these dumb devices in your home like light bulbs or coffee pots, they're behind a secure gateway that can't necessarily be penetrated, that there's one point of contact with the global internet through this gateway, as opposed to every light bulb sending information. So protecting it, there are innovative solutions we can look towards too. I think it's really going to be a balance of different approaches to secure IoT.
Bonnie? I know you've been wanting to say something for a while, sorry.
There's so much going on in this space right now. It's too much for the individual to handle, and it's too much for different even segments of a society to even deal with this, whether it's election interference with disinformation, or if it's interference in the home. Or we don't have the means of knowing either attribution or motive. For example, the chartered professional accountant community in the US was being targeted repeatedly, as I understand, by Russian attacks into their software program that was used almost universally by the CPA community for their work. And they couldn't understand why they were being targeted. And it's still unclear, as far as I know at this point in time, why specifically the CPA software was being targeted, whether perhaps it was to undermine the legitimacy of the taxation and financial system in the US, if it was for specific data on specific individuals or specific sectors, we don't know. The Marriott hotel data breach. Why was Marriott targeted? Was that for extortion? Was it for data identity theft? We don't always know why we're being targeted or by whom, and what to do about it, even if you can figure it out. For example, the U.S. was quite certain that even their midterms were targeted for disinformation or some kind of information disruption during midterm elections. So what to do about all of that has to go beyond any kind of notion that we can control it at this point. So I don't think that necessarily having the social media platforms regulate all of the information circulating is the solution. I'm not even sure that private sector vetting of public discussion is necessarily the solution. Part of it, yes, not all of it. Government regulation, I don't think, is going to cut it either, in terms of either Internet of Things security or information flows either. And education is such a complex issue with already strained systems or shelters. So we're going to have to figure out how we're going to navigate this or build up some kind of resilience to it, because I think that the notion that we can control it to a reasonable degree is still not within our grasp.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, I've actually ran a cybersecurity awareness training for banks' private customers a couple of weeks ago, and it was really eye-opening. So some of the people attending were of kind of retirement age, but they were kind of really, because I talked about some of the threats and incidents and those kind of things, but they were really keen to know, and it kind of touches on what the panel earlier were talking about. How do I know if it is fake news? How can I, if you're kind of 70 years old and you see something on Facebook, how can you understand what's fake news and what's real? And then also think basic things like, how do I change my privacy settings on Facebook so it's not all out on the internet? And it's often the most vulnerable that are being targeted by cyber criminals in terms of whether it's financial gain, etc. So people do want help out there and do want to improve their knowledge and awareness, and we need to do what we can to help people.
Okay, final comment, and then I would like to open it up for questions from the audience.
Quick thought. It was interesting the dollar amount of 1.1 billion for the CBC this morning, because 1.1 billion dollars was the value of cryptocurrency stolen globally as of December 2018, during the 2018 year. The criminal component of cybercrime, it's phenomenal. It's now surpassed the value of narco profits in the U.S. So this is a huge problem. But and again, how do you protect yourself from that? But that's a lot of cryptocurrency, and that was before the Quadriga case came open. So that added quite a lot more.
Paul?
Yeah, and that's the thing about cyber criminals. You know, it's not like a bank robbery. You don't need to leave your home to actually be able to hack into someone's account or withdraw funds, etc. And that's probably the frightening thing. It just is a sort of multi-billion-dollar industry. So there's a real challenge out there for kind of everyone to be more vigilant, and the onus also on companies to protect their customers and their clients.
Suzie?
Yeah, I think it's important too that we're highlighting that it is vulnerable communities that are often targeted by these types of cyber crimes, you know, and looking at what populations of people do we need to be supporting, who do we need to be thinking about who are being targeted and why they're being targeted. You know, often we're seeing, I also do a lot of work around women who've had their intimate images stolen and released, you know, and that's something that's quite common too, where people are having their computers being hacked and these personal things being taken, but because of our gendered society and the risks that women face to their reputation and to their jobs, if that type of content is released, they're specifically being targeted. And yes, it's only $200 here, $300 there that they're paying to these cyber criminals to not have these images released, you know, but that ends up adding up to these multi-million-dollar industries. And so I think it is key that we focus on which groups are being targeted, what are their vulnerabilities, and how do marginalization play into the way that cyber criminals are targeting specific groups.
So Mark, last words, no pressure.
So I think this is a great example of where somebody needs to do something is the absolute worst thing you can say. Every one of us in the room and every one of us who's connected to the internet has a role and a responsibility to ensure that the global internet remains safe. Whether you're from a government department or you're a device manufacturer, an internet service provider, civil society, academics, or an end user, we all have a responsibility as internet users to ensure that the internet remains safe and secure and trusted.
Thank you all. So questions from the audience, and I think there is a mic floating around. Do you have a hand? We scared you all, no questions?
Hi, my name is Walter. I'm just wondering if you could comment on to what level digital literacy in the public sector and among policymakers is contributing to this whole cybersecurity problem and not being regulated and not being taken care of.
So Bonnie, do you want to take that one first, and then we'll see how it evolves?
So if I understand, the question was, how does public education or public university affect policymaking?
Okay. The lack of, perhaps, digital literacy among the policymakers, how does that contribute, or does it contribute to the resolution and lack of resolution of this problem?
Okay. I think Canada, and I don't mean to be too hard because it's a tough problem, and I know people have worked very hard on this for a long time, and we are coming up with new programs and new education and new understandings, including through our trade engagement and other engagement globally. But Canada is still, in my mind, behind. We were late to the table on 5G. We're now in a position where we are in a really difficult spot between the US and China as great powers when we are a middle power, which limits our options. The digital charter is, I think, clearly a lot of work and thought and engagement went into it, but it is not on the level of some of the strategic documents that are guiding policy in other countries. And I go back to the Russia example. They have clear doctrine. They have a legal requirement for a strategic plan for the country and how they're going to move forward. They have a military doctrine that includes cyber activity into how they will action their foreign policy engagement, which is informed by their international law doctrine. It is instituted right into their legal and policy structures, and it's informed by deep research and deep working in there. China, multiple universities on cybersecurity specifically, whole universities. Innopolis is not a smart neighborhood or a smart house, it's a smart economic zone in Tatarstan, outside of Kazakhstan, and not anybody can live there. You have to be a top robotics engineer, top experts, and that is a area to behold in terms of initiative, effort, financing, planning. So our digital charter is definitely a step in the right direction, but we're not up on that level with even, for example, German doctrine, German cyber strategies, or what's coming out of South America, even Africa, other areas. India, very specific on directions they're going to be taking moving forward. So we're moving ahead, but I think the question is absolutely valid. We're still discussing about how we're going to deal with Canadian issues, Canadian place in the world. At the same time, I think we are not seeing exactly what's happening globally amongst other partners, and we're not having those discussions, or at least we're not seeing those discussions in the mainstream media in terms of how Canada's place in the world is changing, and we're not discussing it.
Mark?
I don't know how much we should expect or even trust governments to make the right sound decisions on complex technology issues. I think we need to take a step back and look at how does decision making work, and perhaps a group of civil servants in an office somewhere on Spark Street, deciding how to secure the Internet of Things may not be the best approach. This is why we held a multi-stakeholder approach last year. It was the best option to develop the most robust policy we could find. And kudos to ISED for last year recognizing that this was not something they could do alone. It's too complex, it's too big. So they worked in collaboration with a number of organizations, and I'll say took considerable risk when they made that decision. This is not something governments generally do, is give up control over the process, but they did, and I think the outcome is stronger for it.
Suzie?
Yeah, I think it's important who the government is talking to, because again, we can't expect every politician to understand all technology. And right now, with politicians and with judges and some of the commentary that I've seen, sometimes they don't even understand basic forms of technology such as Twitter. I've read some judicial decisions where their understanding of Twitter is significantly off. So I think it's important that policymakers not be expected to know all technology, but also know who to check in with. They need to check in with technology specialists who understand the technology, and not only understand the technology, but have the skill set to explain it in a way that's understandable. And that's a really challenging skill set to have. I think we have a lot of talented people who understand tech, and there's a smaller group of people who really can explain it in a simple way. And also to look to the people who are being impacted by this technology. So, for my work, making sure you're talking to women, making sure you're talking to people who've experienced the negative impacts of this technology so they know what kind of solutions that they need. For a long time, people were suggesting that if women were having negative interactions with technology, they should just not use it. You should just get off Twitter. You should just get off the internet. You should not use your super convenient coffee maker that you can turn on from home. But the reality is that our digital lives and our online lives and our physical lives are completely integrated, and we need to find ways that can be done safely and done well. And so making sure that you're talking to a broad array of stakeholders so that policymakers and politicians can learn from them and not be expected as individuals to go off and learn this on their own.
Paul?
Just to echo what's been said on the panel, really, that collaboration is key going forward, and not just within Canada, but globally as well, to really get to a point where there is some kind of standard going forward.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, we scared you all. Okay, well, lunch is waiting and we're right on time, so thank you, everybody.